Mr. and Mrs. Brown first met Paddington on a railway station, which was how he came to have such an unusual name for a bear. They were waiting for their daughter Judy when Mr. Brown caught sight of him sitting on an old suitcase behind a pile of mail bags. As they drew near, he stood up and politely raised his hat. "Good afternoon," he said. "Can I help you?" "Well, no," said Mr. Brown. "We were wondering if we could help you." "You're a very small bear," said Mrs. Brown. "Where are you from?" "Darkest Peru," said the bear. "I'm not really supposed to be here at all. I'm a stowaway. I came all the way in a lifeboat, and I ate marmalade. Bears like marmalade. I used to live with my Aunt Lucy, but she had to go into a home for retired bears, so I emigrated." "Oh." "Aunt Lucy always said she wanted me to emigrate when I was old enough, but now that I have, I'm not quite sure what to do next." As he bent down, the Browns caught sight of a label round his neck. It said, "Please look after this bear, thank you." It was the kind of label you couldn't possibly ignore, and in no time at all, things began to happen. Mrs. Brown thought of a name for him. Paddington. And while she went off to look for Judy, Mr. Brown was put in charge of ordering some refreshments. Paddington. Paddington. "Come along, Paddington," said Mr. Brown. "I expect you're hungry after your long journey." "I am," said Paddington. "Very." Paddington had never been taken out to tea before, and he was very excited. "I don't suppose there are many bears who've been inside a buffet, Mr. Brown," he exclaimed. No," said Mr. Brown. Especially one with buns." "I think perhaps I'd better sit down." Yes," said Mr. Brown, trying hard to pretend that he had tea with a bear every day of his life. "Hello, Mrs. Brown," called Paddington as he caught sight of the others. "Don't go away. We're in here." "Watch out," shouted Mr. Brown. But he was too late. Paddington was already up to his knees in trouble. "Henry," cried Mrs. Brown, "what are you doing?" "What am I doing?" "Look at him. He's all covered in jam and cream. I've never seen such a mess. I don't know what the manageress will say." "Or the taxi driver," said Judy. "Taxi driver?" "Judy's right," said Mrs. Brown. "We can't leave him here, not in his present state." "Don't worry, Mrs. Brown," called Paddington. "I'll clear up the mess. Bears are good at clearing up messes." "Number 32 Windsor Gardens, please, as quickly as you can." "Not too quickly," called Mrs. Brown. "We've 2 more to come." "Is that one of them?" asked the driver. "He's covered in white stuff." "It's only cream," said Judy. "I dare say," said the driver. "But bears is 6 pence extra." "Sticky bears is 9 pence. 9 pence extra!" exclaimed Paddington hotly. He directed a hard stare at the driver. He seemed to go a funny shade of pink. "Gosh," said Judy, "how did you learn to do that?" "My Aunt Lucy taught me," said Paddington. "She said it might come in useful one day." "Mary," said Mr. Brown, "are you sure we're doing the right thing?" "That," said Mrs. Brown, "remains to be seen. I've never had a bear about the house before, but I have a feeling things may never be quite the same again." The first morning in his new home, Paddington woke to the news that Mrs. Brown and Judy were taking him for a trip on the Underground. There was also a large tray of breakfast things beside his bed. So much seemed to be happening at once, he had a job deciding what to do first. So he started on the bacon. "Hurry up," called Judy. "We're going shopping and it's nearly time to leave." "Coming," cried Paddington. "I've never been on an underground before," he announced. "I'm not sure if you'll be going now," said Judy. "Not with bacon sticking out of your suitcase like that. Look at it." "It's for emergencies," said Paddington. "Bears often have emergencies." "In fact, I think I've got one coming on now." "It's very strange," said Mrs. Brown. "I've never heard so many dogs. Perhaps it's the fine weather bringing them out." "I don't think it's the weather, Mrs. Brown," gasped Paddington. "I think it's my bacon. What's left of it." After the excitement of Windsor Gardens, Paddington found the underground much more to his liking, and he hurried on ahead of the others. Everything seemed to have been thought of. There was a moving staircase, pictures on the wall. There was even a sign with his name on, showing which way to go. "Paddington," cried Judy, "you're going the wrong way." But it was too late. By the time he'd realized his mistake, Paddington was at the top of the stairs again. "Here," said the ticket collector. "What's all this? You haven't been anywhere yet." "I think I must have made a mistake at the bottom," said Paddington. "Bert," called the collector, "there's a young bear here smelling of bacon. Says he's made a mistake at the bottom." "I'm sorry," said Paddington. "I'm not used to escalators. We don't have any in Darkest Peru." "Darkest Peru?" repeated the inspector. "Oh, well, in that case, you'd better get back down, but don't let me catch you up to any more tricks. You're worse than them dogs." "Shoo, go away." "There he goes again," cried Judy. "Do something, Paddington." "That," said Mrs. Brown, "was a dangerous thing to say. I think he's done it." "You again?" said the inspector. "I'll have you know escalators is for the convenience of passengers, not for the likes of young bears to play on." "It doesn't seem very convenient to me," said Paddington. "I've been here ages and I haven't got anywhere yet." "We're supposed to be going shopping," said Mrs. Brown. "That's as may be," said the inspector sternly, "but pressing the escalator stop button without a very good reason is against the rules. Persons are expected to abide by the rules." "Did you say persons?" asked Judy. "That's right, and I've got my job to do. It's bad enough being pestered by dogs." "Well, Paddington's not a person," said Judy. "He's a bear. Isn't that lucky?" Said the inspector. Well, don't let it happen again." "I think you're a very kind inspector," said Judy. "Don't you, Paddington?" "Very," agreed Paddington. "In fact," he announced, "I shall always travel from here in future. It's a very good station if you don't want to go anywhere, especially if you have an emergency on the way." Paddington had never been shopping in London before, especially at a store like Barkridge's. Equally, Barkridge's had never had a customer quite like Paddington, especially in the gentleman's outfitting department. "We would like some bear's pyjamas, please," said Mrs. Brown. "Bear's pyjamas?" repeated the assistant. "Has Madam tried something in government surplus?" "Indeed not," said Mrs. Brown. "I've never heard anything like it. Have you, Paddington?" "Never," said Paddington hotly. and he gave the man one of his special hard stares. "Yes, sir," said the assistant. "At once, sir." "He's been sleeping in his duffel coat," explained Mrs. Brown, "and we don't want that." "We certainly don't," agreed the assistant. "Would the young gentleman care for something in stripes? They're all the rage just now." "I'd sooner have something in spots," said Paddington. "If I had a pair like these, I don't think I would ever get lost, not even if I fell out of bed by mistake." "You can say that again," murmured Judy. "The changing rooms are on the right," called the assistant. "Don't go wrong." "I do hope they fit," said Mrs. Brown. "He'll be most disappointed if they don't." "So shall we all, madam," said the assistant. So far, pyjama week at Barkridge's had been a disaster. In fact, Paddington was the first customer they'd had for days. But if Barkridge's were unhappy about their pyjamas, Paddington was even more upset by the state of their changing rooms. As far as he could make out, most of the doors were locked, and when he did find one which opened, he practically had to force his way through. On the other hand, once inside, it was all very different. It was more like the inside of a house, and he was most impressed. Paddington wasn't sure how long he slept, but he was suddenly woken by a very strange noise. It sounded just like rain, but as he looked out of the window, he had yet another shock. "Well," said a voice behind him, "what are you doing in our shop window, Bear?" "Your shop window?" repeated Paddington. He suddenly wished he hadn't bought such loud pyjamas. "Oh dear," he announced to the world in general, "I think I've been recognized." But to his surprise, the manager of Barkridge's was more than delighted with all that had happened. "Bear," he boomed, "you're what we in the trade call a trend-setter. Since you went to bed in our shop window, those pyjamas have been selling like hot cakes. Look at them. They've all gone." And to show just how pleased he was, he offered Paddington anything he liked to choose in the store as a present. Paddington licked his lips. All the excitement had made him feel hungry, and he was tempted to ask for one of the hot cakes the manager had mentioned. Then he caught sight of the very thing, some Wellington boots. "I'd like a pair of these, please," he announced. "If it rains the next time I'm in bed, it'll stop the ends of my pyjamas getting soggy. That would never do, especially now you've sold out." One day, Mr. Gruber decided to take Paddington on a mystery outing. He gave him a bar of chocolate for his lunch, and they set out early in order to avoid the crowds. Paddington liked outings with Mr. Gruber, and to have a mystery thrown in as well seemed very good value indeed. "Wait until you get inside," said Mr. Gruber. "You're in for a surprise." Paddington grew more and more mystified. The building seemed to be full of people in strange clothes, standing about doing nothing. "I shan't be a moment, Mr. Gruber," he called. "I just want to buy some souvenirs." He hurried over to a nearby kiosk and raised his hat politely, several times, to the lady behind the counter. But for some strange reason, she didn't reply. "Excuse me," he announced. "I'd like 3 large postcards, please. One for my scrapbook, one for Aunt Lucy, and one for Mr. Gruber." "I don't think you're going to be very lucky. I think she's made of wax, Mr. Brown." "Made of wax?" exclaimed Paddington. He gave the lady a hard stare. "I've never heard of anyone being made of wax before." "You'll find a lot of people like that in here, Mr. Brown. Most of them aren't real at all. It's what's known as a Waxworks museum." Mr. Gruber went off to buy some tickets, and after he'd gone, Paddington gazed round the hall. Apart from having no souvenirs, his chocolate was beginning to melt. Not wishing to offend his friend, he looked for somewhere to deposit it. And nearby, he thought he saw the very thing.
"Here," said the attendant. "What do you think you're doing? That's my ticket box. It's not for the likes of young bears to drop their remains in."
"I'm very sorry," exclaimed Paddington. "I thought you were a Waxworks like everyone else."
"Waxworks? I'll give you Waxworks. Come back here."
But Paddington was already making good his escape. Hurrying down some stairs, as fast as his legs would carry him, he found himself in another large room, full of figures. Worse still, he could hear the sound of voices getting nearer and nearer. He decided there was only one thing for it. He would have to become a Waxworks himself.
"And this group," said a voice, "represents England at the time of Charles I. In the middle is Oliver Cromwell, about to join the Ironsides."
"If that's Oliver Cromwell," said a woman, "then aim the Queen of Sheba."
"Besides, they never wore duffel coats in them days,"
agreed a man.
"Horrible," complained another woman.
"Don't look, Deirdre."
"I don't know," said her husband. "Horrible it may be, but fancy making all them whiskers out of wax."
"Oh!" shrieked Deirdre. "I'm sure I saw his nose move." "There you are! I told you so! He's done it again!" Paddington decided he was fed up. Apart from an itchy nose, he was beginning to wish he'd picked an easier pose. And he felt hungry. "I'm not Oliver Cromwell about to join the Ironsides," he announced. "I'm Paddington Bear, and I'm about to feed my insides. Good afternoon."
"I doubt if even Oliver Cromwell could have made a better exit than that," said Mr. Gruber later that day. "And he couldn't have surprised his audience more. It's in all the evening papers. Waxworks Museum latest, Chamber of Horrors mystery deepens." Lots of people go on mystery outings, Mr. Brown, but not many can say they've actually taken part in one. Paddington considered the matter. Although he hadn't managed to buy any postcards, he felt sure the newspaper cuttings would look very good in his scrapbook. "All the same, I'm glad I didn't live in Mr. Cromwell's time," he announced. "It must have been difficult drinking cocoa in a helmet." And I'm sure he never went on such nice outings. One day, Mr. Gruber took Paddington on an outing to the law courts. "I think you'll find it interesting, Mr. Brown," he said. "It's a bit like watching a television play. Wait here, and I'll see if I can find you a good case to watch." Paddington thanked Mr. Gruber, and then settled down to a quick sip of some of Mrs. Bird's steaming hot cocoa. To his surprise, he'd hardly begun when he heard his name being called. "Calling Mr. Brown! Calling Mr. Brown!" "Here, is your name Brown? 'Cause if it is, they're waiting for you."
"Mr. Gruber must have been quick," exclaimed Paddington.
"I don't know about Mr. Gruber. It's old Justice Eagle trying the case today, and he don't like to be kept waiting. You best get a move on."
"I'm sorry, Mr. Eagle," called Paddington. "I'm afraid my eyes got steamed up."
"Your eyes got steamed up? 'Pon my soul, in all my years as a judge, I've never heard of that as an excuse before."
It's not an excuse, Mr. Eagle. It's the cocoa.
Do you swear?
Paddington gave the man a hard stare.
Never. My Aunt Lucy taught me not to. Silence in court. I see no mention of an Aunt Lucy, Mr. Cloudsworthy. Do I take it the prosecution are not going to call her? To tell you the truth, I don't think she would hear you if you did call her, Mr. Eagle. She's in Peru. Aunt Lucy's in Peru? I find this very hard to accept. With respect, my lad, I don't think she's important. Aunt Lucy's not important? Exclaimed Paddington. She brought me up. Quite so, but we have a very big case here. I've got a small one. It's got a secret compartment where I keep all my important papers. Really? I thought perhaps it was where you kept your briefs. My briefs? But I'm only here for the day. Silence! This is no laughing matter. Briefs are papers lawyers bring with them when they attend court. Oh, I don't have any of those, Mr. Eagle, said Paddington, but I've got some marmalade sandwiches. Is this really part of the evidence you're submitting, Mr. Cloudsworthy? A bear's sandwich? We'd better mark it Exhibit A. I'll examine it more closely later. Mrs. Bird will be pleased, said Paddington. I don't think she's ever had any of her marmalade exhibited before, especially in court. In that case, we'd better call her. Perhaps she can throw some light on this unfortunate affair. Call Mrs. Bird. Call Mrs. Bird. I don't think she's here either. I expect she's out shopping with Mrs. Brown. Mrs. Bird's out shopping? Really, this is intolerable. Is there no one here today? You could try Mr. Gruber, said Paddington. I know he's here. At least, he was. Call Mr. Gruber. Call Mr. Gruber. Good gracious. I'm afraid, said Mr. Gruber, there has been a slight misunderstanding. As I'm sure your lordship realizes, there are a good many Browns in this world. I believe this is the one you really wanted to see. Mr. Justice Eagle looked at Paddington and then at the exhibits in front of him. It's been a very trying morning, he said, in more ways than one. I think perhaps it's time we stopped for elevenses. Paddington was most impressed at the thought of a judge knowing about elevenses. Perhaps, Mr. Eagle, he said, you'd like some more exhibits. There are lots more where this one came from, and I don't suppose I shall be coming to court again for a long time. One day, the Browns decided to go for a picnic on the river. It seemed like a good idea at the time. It was a nice, sunny day, and they hadn't been on an outing for a long time. Mr. Brown put Paddington in charge of the pole, and after announcing there would be a competition with a prize for whoever caught the first fish of the day, he gave the signal to move off. Right, cast off. Anchors away. Do what, Mr. Brown? Called Paddington. Dad means we're ready to go. Put the pole in the water and push, called Judy. Oh, dear, said Mrs. Brown. I'm sure something awful's about to happen. Don't worry, Mrs. Brown, said Paddington. Bears are good at punting. Oh. Help! 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 Mercy me, cried Mrs. Bird. Don't worry about the gramophone, Henry. Do something. How can I? Paddington's got the pole. It's all right. Somebody's coming to the rescue. They're grabbing hold of him now. He'll be most upset. He had a special bath before he came out. We'd best be using my sunshade as a paddle. The thing is, said a man, who's going to be the first to give him the kiss of life. Don't all move at once. If you ask me, we ought to try artificial respiration first. Artificial respiration? Exclaimed Paddington hotly. I'd rather have the real thing. I'm sure Mr. Brown won't mind paying for it. Oh, help! I told you not to sit up. Now you've had a relapse. I haven't had a relapse, exclaimed Paddington. I've lost my hat. Well, if that's the worst that ever happens to you... Paddington gave the man a hard stare. That hat's been handed down, he exclaimed. It was given to me by my uncle in darkest Peru. There isn't another one like it in the world. Darkest Peru. Perhaps it's sunk, or got swept over the weir. I wouldn't mind betting it's got swept over the weir. If you ask me, it's a matter for the lock-keeper. It might be too late. It might have got sucked into a whirlpool. My hat? Sucked into a whirlpool? Repeated Paddington, hardly able to believe his ears. Don't worry, Paddington, we're here. Jump on board. We'll take you to the lock-keeper. He'll help if anyone can. Paddington considered the matter for a moment or two. I think, he announced at last, I shall walk, if you don't mind. It's a lot safer, and I can dry out on the way. I knew he'd be upset, said Mrs. Bird. Having 2 baths in one day, when there isn't an hour in the month, is too much for any bear, especially Paddington. A hat, said the lock-keeper. Is that what it is? I thought perhaps it was some kind of a bomb. That's why I fished it out and shoved it in a bucket. I thought it might blow up me weir. You can tell it's a hat because it's got a marmalade sandwich inside. At least what's left of one. Paddington peered inside the bucket in the hope of finding some remains, and as he did so, he nearly fell over backwards with surprise. Guess what, Mr. Brown, he exclaimed. I think I've won the prize for the first catch of the day. Look. Good heavens, exclaimed Mr. Brown. Do you see what I can see? You just can't compete, said Jonathan. And he's got a free hat wash into the bargain. I expect, said Mrs. Bird, they were after your sandwich. Fish like bread. Perhaps, said Paddington, I won't have any 11s after all. I shall save myself for 12. I don't want to spoil my picnic. Picnics make you hungry. Especially when you have them out of doors. One morning, Paddington arrived at Mr. Gruber's antique shop for his 11s and found to his surprise that his friend had put the shutters up. He'd only just got over that shock when he had yet another one. Boom! It was all very unexpected, and he couldn't make head or tail of it. Don't worry, Mr. Brown, came Mr. Gruber's voice. We didn't mean to alarm you. It's such nice weather, I thought I would take a day off. I'm taking you all on an outing to the Tower of London. We're going to see the crown jewels and the beefeaters. They're really yeoman warders, but I understand they are called beefeaters because in the old days they used to taste all the royal food to make sure it was safe. Paddington licked his lips while he considered the matter. I think seeing a beefeater sounds even nicer than having 11s, Mr. Gruber, he announced at last. Paddington had never seen a beefeater before, and as soon as they arrived at the tower, he hurried up to one and politely raised his hat. Would you like one of my marmalade sandwiches, he asked. I expect it'll make a nice change from beef. Oh, gosh, groaned Judy. Here we go again. A marmalade sandwich? The yeoman stared at the object as if he could hardly believe his eyes. Then he looked down,
But Paddington was already on his way. He hadn't liked the expression on the man's face at all, and he hurried to join the others.
This is where they keep the ravens, Mr. Brown. They do say that if they ever fly away, then the tower will fall down.
Paddington peered anxiously at the empty cage. "Perhaps we'd better go, Mr. Gruber," he said. "I shouldn't worry, Paddington. They keep their wings clipped and they let them out during the day. Look, there's one over there." "He looks as if he's got his eye on Paddington," said Jonathan. But the ravens were soon forgotten when Mr. Gruber took them into a very special part of the tower where the crown jewels were kept. Paddington had never seen anything like them before.
"That crown has over 400 stones," said Mr. Gruber, "and it weighs nearly 5 pounds. It's worth a fortune."
"I can see why the Queen doesn't want the tower to fall down," exclaimed Paddington. And as soon as Mr. Gruber had finished his explanations, he hurried outside in order to make sure the raven was still there. To his surprise, there were now 2 birds, and he gave them both a hard stare. As if by magic, 2 more arrived. Paddington turned round and round 3 times just to make sure he wasn't dreaming, and when he looked again, there were 8 birds, all in a row. "There must be something about you," said Judy. "Perhaps it's the colour of your hat." Paddington took a firm grip of his suitcase. He didn't like the way things were going at all. "I think I shall go for my 11s, he announced. "Outside the tower." Paddington felt sure that if the ravens had had their wings clipped, they wouldn't be able to follow him. But he was wrong, for as he came through the arch, the beefeater called out to him,
"Where do you think you're going with our ravens, young fella me bear? Look, they're all following you. We can't have that and risk having the place fall down. I'm afraid you'll have to stay here until we've decided what's best."
Gosh, fancy Paddington being sent to the tower.
"Wait a minute. Do you know what I think the trouble is? I think they're after young Mr. Brown's marmalade sandwiches."
And sure enough, after Paddington had given the birds his sandwiches, they stayed happily where they were.
"Well," said the beefeater, "I never knew ravens liked marmalade sandwiches. I think perhaps you'd better leave us your address. Then if any of our birds get lost, we can send for you."
"I think," said Paddington, "if I'm to be a marmalade eater, I'd better start work now, just to make sure." One morning, Paddington paid a visit to his local bank in order to withdraw his savings. It had to do with a surprise outing to the seaside, which Mr. Brown had told them about the previous evening. Mrs. Bird had opened an account for him earlier in the year, and although he'd often given the premises some hard stares when he'd gone past, he'd never actually been inside before, let alone drawn anything out. A trip to the seaside sounded a very good excuse indeed. "I would like to withdraw all my savings, please," he announced, "with interest." "With interest?" repeated the clerk. "Oh dear, are you expecting a rainy day?" "I hope not," exclaimed Paddington. "We are going to the seaside." "Yeah, quite. May I see your bank book, please, sir?" "Thank you. Yuck! It's all sticky." "I'm afraid I had an accident when I was doing my accounts under the bedclothes last night," said Paddington. "Doing your accounts under the bedclothes?" "Bears always do their accounts under the bedclothes," said Paddington firmly. "I was working out my interest and put my paw in a jar of marmalade by mistake." "Ugh! It hardly seems worth getting in such a mess for the sake of 2pence. 2pence!" exclaimed Paddington. "I don't think that's very interesting." "You only had £1 to start with," said the clerk. "Interest has to do with how long you leave your money with us." "Well, mine's been with you since Christmas." "Twopence. That makes £1 and 2 pence in all. Perhaps you'd like to count it." Paddington needed no second bidding. He was beginning to have a nasty feeling about banks. And a moment later, his worst fears were confirmed. "This isn't my note," he exclaimed hotly. "It's got a different number on it." "A different number? You can't expect to get back the same note you put in. Yours is probably worn out by now. I dare say it's been burnt." "Burnt? You've burnt my note?" "I didn't say it had been burnt. I only said it might have been. Oh, come back." As Paddington hurried into the street, there was a look in his eye that boded ill for anyone who got in his way. Mrs. Bird had often drummed into him what to do in case of an emergency, and he couldn't remember ever having had quite such an emergency before. "What I would like to know," said a policeman later that morning, "is how anyone can manage to call the police, the fire brigade, and an ambulance all at the same time." Jonathan and Judy exchanged glances. "You do ask people to dial 999 if they see anything suspicious. And burning pound notes must seem very suspicious to a bear." "I'm afraid I got my paw stuck in the dial. Every time I called help, they put me on to someone else." "That's when he called us," said Judy. "Got paw stuck in dial. I don't know what the super will say about this." "Never mind, Paddington," said Judy. "At least you've got your twopence interest." Paddington shook his head sadly. "I haven't even got that," he said. "I used it when I phoned you just now." "Well, in the circumstances, I'm sure Floyd's will refund it for you, and you can keep your account open. And I'll make sure you get a nice new £1 note for your outing tomorrow." Paddington considered the matter for a moment. "Thank you very much, Mr. Floyd," he said at last, "but I think I'll keep my twopence as well. You never know. If I have trouble with my new note, I may want to call the fire brigade again." One day, Mr. Brown decided to take everyone to the theatre as a treat, and he reserved a box so that he could get them all in. Paddington had never been to the theatre before, and he sniffed the air excitedly as he hurried on ahead of the others. It had a nice, warm smell, and everyone seemed very friendly and helpful. "Would you like a programme, sir?" "Yes, please," said Paddington. "I'll have 6, if I may." "Thank you, sir. And will you be having coffee in the interval?" Paddington licked his lips. "Yes, please," he announced. "I'll have 6 of those, too." "Very good, sir. That'll be £5. £5? Help!" "Oh, dear, Paddington, I think you've lost your marmalade sandwich. Look." "Must you bring sandwiches to the theatre?" asked Mr. Brown. "You've only just had supper." "It's all right, Mr. Brown. I've got some more in my suitcase." "That," said Mr. Brown, "is not what I meant." But Mr. Brown's words went unheeded as the curtain rose and they settled back to enjoy the show. The evening was a tribute to Cecily Bloom, the famous actor, who was performing pieces from his repertoire. The first item on the program was a piece of Victorian melodrama in which he played the villain. As far as Paddington could make out, the luckless heroine seemed to spend most of her time either tied to a railway line in the face of the 6:20 from Euston, and never darken, or about to part company with herself in the local sawmill. He gave Cecily several hard stares through his opera glasses. But either he was too far away, or something happened as they passed through the lens, for they had little or no effect. Cecily was adamant. And despite the snow and the pleas from the heroine, it was clear from the expression on his face as the curtain came down that he felt he had won the day. "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Brown, "I do hope the second half is a bit more cheerful." "I hope he's a bit better at remembering his lines," said Mr. Brown. "He was making half of that up. It's readings from Shakespeare next. He's a famous playwright." "Oh, gosh, where's Paddington got to?" "Perhaps he's gone for an ice cream," said Jonathan. "Perhaps," said Mrs. Bird, and then again, "perhaps not. Knowing that bear, it's anyone's guess where he might be." Cecilia Bloom looked at Paddington in amazement. "Would you mind repeating that, bear?" he boomed. "I've come to tell you to take back your daughter," exclaimed Paddington. "It's snowing hard and she hasn't got a duffel coat. If you like, I expect Mr. and Mrs. Brown would take her in. I expect..." Having delivered his ultimatum, Paddington waited for the storm to break. But to his surprise, Cecilia, who had been looking very gloomy until then, suddenly brightened. "My dear bear, this is the nicest thing that's happened to me in years. The fact that you actually believe what you've just seen. To tell you the truth, I've been having a little trouble with my lines. The prompter's been taken ill, and I suppose you wouldn't like to do me a favor, would you?" Mr. Brown gazed at the slip of paper the usherette had given him. "I have been given a very important job, signed Paddington." What can it mean? But the Browns didn't have long to wait for an answer. As the curtain went up, Cecilia began his famous recital from Hamlet. "To be..." "Or not to be, Cecilia," called Paddington. "Thank you, Bear. To be or not to be, Cecilia, that is the question." "No, it isn't," whispered Mr. Brown. "The question is, how does Paddington get away with it?" "That," said Mrs. Bird, "is something even Shakespeare would find hard to answer." "Adrian Crisp? Garden ornaments?" said Mrs. Bird. "What on earth is that bear up to now? I found this under his bed this morning. Looks as if it's been torn out of a magazine." "Perhaps it's to do with the new patio Mr. Gruber's been building," replied Mrs. Brown. "He said something about wanting to buy a finishing touch for it when he came in last night. If Paddington's got anything to do with it, finishing touch could be the right description." Mrs. Bird held strong views about Paddington's goings-on, but luckily for her peace of mind, his present ones were taking place quite a long way from home. Paddington had a determined look in his eye, one which had been there ever since his friend, Mr. Gruber, had shown him his new patio. Over the years, Mr. Gruber had been very kind, and it seemed a good chance to try and repay him. Looking round Mr. Crisp's emporium, Paddington decided there were some very good finishing touches indeed. One in particular caught his eye. "Excuse me, Mr. Crisp," he announced. "I'd like to buy one of those lions, if I may." "A lion? Oh, my goodness, how nice. That'll be £200. £200 for a lion? But it's made of stone. You could get a real one for that." "I dare say, but these lions happen to have come from a stately home. They are simply steeped in history." Paddington took a closer look at one of the lions. It certainly appeared to have been steeped in something, but he was much too polite to say so. "How much were you thinking of paying?" asked Mr. Crisp. "I was thinking of 10p," said Paddington. 10p? Don't strain your resources, will you? I suppose I might be able to find you one or two old bricks. Or you could have that ball you're sitting on." Paddington considered the matter for a moment. "What is it?" he asked. "For 10p," said Mr. Crisp. You don't ask questions like that. And I'm afraid you'll have to arrange your own transport. That's all right, Mr. Crisp. I've brought a bag. I expect I can manage. It will... That was Mrs. Bird's best carrier bag. Oh my. I'll see if I can find you some brown paper. There's a bus stop just outside. If you hurry, you may just catch one. Oh, dear. Fancy you going to all that trouble just for me, said Mr. Gruber. I wish I'd seen the expression on the conductor's face. I wish I hadn't, said Paddington. I had to carry it in the end, and I think I may have strained my resources. I don't suppose there are many bears who've taken a boulder on a London bus, Mr. Brown, let alone an early Roman cocoa stand. An early Roman cocoa stand? Exclaimed Paddington. Well, perhaps not Roman exactly, but it's certainly very old. And not even Julius Caesar himself could have had a nicer finishing touch for his patio. Or one that makes his 11s taste better. One day, Mr. Gruber decided to take Jonathan, Judy, and Paddington on an outing to a nearby park so that they could hear a band concert. Paddington was very excited, especially as Mr. Gruber paid extra for a deck chair so that he would be able to watch all that went on in comfort. It's a long time since I last went to a band concert, said Mr. Gruber as they settled themselves down. I've never been to one, Mr. Gruber, said Paddington. They're going to play part of Schubert's unfinished symphony later on. Paddington stared at Judy as if he could hardly believe his ears. What? He exclaimed. Mr. Gruber paid 5 for my deck chair, and Schubert hasn't even finished writing his symphony? Well, it's too late now, said Jonathan. He died in 1828. But Paddington wasn't listening. 5, he exclaimed bitterly. Shh, began Judy. I think they're about to start playing again. But it was too late. Paddington was feeling so upset by the whole affair, he was already on his way to complain. Excuse me, he announced. I would like to see Mr. Schubert, please. Mr. Schubert? I don't know any under that name, dear. There's a Bert what sees to the deck chairs, but it's his day off today. Do you know a Mr. Schubert, Glad? There's a young bear gentleman out here asking for him. Sounds like one of them musicians. They usually has funny names. He wrote a symphony, said Paddington, only he forgot to finish it. Oh, dear. I'm sorry about that. It's too bad. No one does anything proper these days. If you want something done, you're best doing it yourself. If I were you, I'd go and wait under the bandstand. You're bound to catch them when they come off. Paddington needed no second bidding. He hurried off to the bandstand as fast as his legs would carry him. And after giving the back of the conductor's head a very hard stare indeed, he made his way in through a door in the side. Oh, let me out! Oh.
"Oh, dear," said Judy. "I do wish Paddington would hurry back. I've never known such a bear for disappearing." "There's a surprise item next," said Mr. Gruber. "I hope he doesn't miss that. Young Mr. Brown does love surprises." "Gosh," cried Jonathan, "look, there's something funny going on in the bandstand." "Whatever can it be?" asked Judy. "Good afternoon, everyone," said Paddington. "I'm looking for Mr. Schubert, and I'm afraid I got locked inside the bandstand by mistake." "Well," said Mr. Gruber, as they stood waiting to cross the road later that afternoon, "they said it was going to be a surprise item, but I don't think anyone, not even the conductor, bargained for quite such a surprise. It's a good thing somebody started the applause. Otherwise, there's no knowing what would have happened. I wonder who it was." But Mr. Gruber didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the band. "Why don't you give them a wave, Mr. Brown?" he said. Paddington did as he was told, and he added several bears' cheers for good measure. "I think the man in charge saluted me, Mr. Gruber," he announced excitedly. "I have a feeling he did too, Mr. Brown. If I were you, I'd make a note of it in your scrapbook. I don't suppose it happens every day, and it's a very good way to round off a young bear's treat in the park." One day, Mr. Brown decided to celebrate the anniversary of Paddington's arrival in England by taking all the family out to dinner at a famous restaurant called the Porchester. "Well, Paddington," he said as they consulted the menu, "what would you like to start with? Soup? Hors d'oeuvre?" "I don't know what I would like, Mr. Brown," said Paddington. "My program's full of mistakes, and I can't understand a thing." "Mistakes?" said the head waiter. "There is never a mistake on the Porchester menu." "Those aren't mistakes, Paddington. It's French." "French? Fancy printing a menu in French." Have you anything suitable for a young bear's treat?" asked Mr. Brown. "A young bear's treat, sir? We at the Porchester pride ourselves that there is nothing we cannot offer." "In that case," said Paddington, "I'll have a marmalade sandwich to be going on with." "I beg your pardon, sir? Did you say a marmalade sandwich?" "Yes, please," said Paddington, "with custard." "With custard? You did say there was nothing you couldn't offer." "Marmalade sandwich for the young bear gentleman, with custard. One marmalade sandwich with custard. Una marmalade sandwich with a custard. Mamma mia!" "Perhaps, sir, you would care for some hors d'oeuvre while it's being prepared." "Yes, please," said Paddington. "I don't think I've ever had horses' d'oeuvres before. It looks very good value." "Oh, dear," groaned Judy. "Paddington, you're not supposed to eat it from the trolley." "Perhaps the young gentleman would like some custard with that, too." Paddington gave the man a hard stare. "Custard with sausages?" he exclaimed. "No, thank you. Besides, I think I've lost one of my onions. They're a bit difficult with paws. I picked it up like that and... Oh dear, I think it's done it again. It sounds as though someone's found it." "He would have to be carrying Paddington's marmalade sandwich," said Mrs. Bird. "We shall never hear the last of it." "Oh, dear, Henry," said Mrs. Brown. "We've only been here 3 minutes, and just look at the mess." But Mr. Brown was much more bothered by the look on the head waiter's face. "I'm afraid," said the man, "I must ask you to leave. Ordering marmalade sandwiches with custard. Helping yourself to the hors d'oeuvre trolley. Throwing onions. You'll get the restaurant a bad name with the other diners. Nonsense. If that bear goes, I go.
I'm one of the other diners, and I'm not upset. Best thing that's happened in years. Place needs brightening up. Too stuffy for half. I'll have a marmalade sandwich, too, with double custard. Yes, Sir Huntley. At once, Sir Huntley. One marmalade sandwich with double custard. One marmalade sandwich with double custard. Una marmalade sandwich with a double custard. Poof! Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Sir Huntley Martin, the Marmalade King. I've been in marmalade for 50 years. Paddington licked his lips. Fancy being in marmalade for 50 years, he exclaimed. And I've been coming here for 40 years. Perhaps you'd allow me to join you. I know some good things for a young bear's treat. Here we go again, said Jonathan. Bears, said Mrs. Bird, always fall on their feet. I think, said Paddington happily, everyone ought to have an anniversary, at least once a year.